Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
And joining us from Texas, from Austin, Toby LeBlanc. Hello Toby and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Hello, hello. It's good to be with you all.
It's lovely to have you on our show, and we are here to talk not only about your book, but also, before we dive into the background, the culture that is so prominent in your book. What can you tell our listeners about your book?
Well, Dark Roost started as I was listening to a podcast actually about someone who was a Jewish man in New York talking about his take on Jewish culture within New York, and what he was writing a book from inside the culture. And I started thinking about, well, what does that mean about my culture? Has anybody ever talked about our culture from the inside? Because in America, in Louisiana, I think a lot of people look at our culture from the outside. We have a lot of, we show up in the world, I think, in caricatures sometimes. We our food has been kind of taken over and spread countrywide and even, I think, worldwide. But a lot of people don't know where it comes from. So I wanted to write a book that describes our culture from the inside, from the people who live it, but also didn't want to hold back on the good or the ugly parts or the complicated parts of our culture. So that was the impetus behind the book.
And you wrote this book in an interesting way. You put it into parts, and each part of the book is told from the main character's point of view in this part. So we always have a first person narrator. And what I also found interesting of the way you tell the story is that it's always the same span of time, but like I said, from different perspectives. Was it planned that way, or did it just happen along the way while you were writing?
Honestly, a little of both. I started writing it from the first character's perspective that shows up in the book, the young man, Will. And as I wrote it, I started thinking about what he saw inside the family and wondering what other people saw from inside the family, because I'm a firm believer that nobody owns the truth, that it is a multifaceted thing, and everybody looks at something and sees something different. And I think also it became, from each family member's perspective, it changed to be 4 different perspectives, because I think that's really the only way you can understand what's happening in a family, is to hear from each piece, because they're all going to have their impressions, both of what's happening and of each other. And so as I was writing, I started wondering, well, what do other people in the family think about Will? And then as I wrote that person, what do they think about that person? So it became, it kind of grew from there, to be able to show that, how complicated, again, our families are, how everybody has a different space, but also in hopes that when somebody would read it, they get something. If they take a step back, they'd see the whole picture from all the different angles.
Was one of these points of view of the different characters more difficult to write than the others?
I think so. I for different reasons too. So there's also a young woman in the book named, her nickname is Addie. Her whole name is Addison Mouton. And she was right, because I kind of had to go back to my 20-year-old self being very, very confused. And she's who's kind of getting all the pressures of that, or the expectations of her gender inside the culture. And I've never had to live through those expectations. So there was really kind of digging deep and talking to some other women in my culture about their experiences, to try and figure it out. And then there's the mother in the book, Beatrice. She was difficult because I felt like I knew her really, really well. She is like so many Cajun moms in Louisiana, to the point where it almost felt too intimate at times. Like, if I should be saying this, if I don't know if I should be going there with her, but it was accurate, at least from what I've heard from some of my other Cajun friends that read it. Like, no, that's my mom. So okay, I guess I did it okay.
Now that you say that, and you mentioned the book you read about this man from the Jewish community. It does remind me now a little bit of a Jewish mother or an Italian mother.
I've been amazed in talking to other people from other cultures that come from other European cultures and other Mediterranean cultures. There's a lot of overlap there seems to be because in a lot of ways, as part of our history in Louisiana, as part of Cajun culture, we retained a lot of our old culture from when we actually immigrated from France in the 1600s. In some ways, that is how we kept our identity whenever we had been deported by the British in the 1700s, whenever we came to Louisiana. And we were then in the early 1900s, they tried to educate the French out of us and tried to educate the culture out. So in a lot of ways, we held on to the oldest parts of ourselves to retain our identity. In a lot of ways, I think we maintained a lot of those old European parts. In fact, a lot of people say when they come to South Louisiana, it feels like they're not in America anymore.
Yeah,
So it has more European pieces, I think.
yeah, that's what I can imagine. Like you said, you kept those past traditions. And from Will's point of view, but also a little bit from Edison's point of view, we also get the impression it can be oppressive. This whole tradition, this importance of family, they do feel a bit caged. And it's also the word they use or you use when you write them.
Yes. Yeah. The point of view, so the book, I think in a lot of ways, I was thinking a lot about change and about culture because just like I named that we hold on to old pieces. In a lot of ways, our culture is backward looking a lot of times. I think that we resist change, that we are afraid of change. But the world is changing whether we like it or not. We're trying to hold on to things from 300 years ago. But we have internet. Well, I'm speaking to you in Austria. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. Um, so a lot of, especially for Will and Addison, it was about how to transition, how to make this culture make sense in a modern world. I picked the year of 1999 just because it was a transition year. You know, we were moving into a new millennia. I kind of tried to keep that in the background as a change piece. I also the reason that I named the book Dark Roux is to me it was a metaphor. And we can talk about recipes if you like.
Yes,
But to make a
please.
roux, yes, please. So to make a dark roux, to make a Louisiana style dark roux, it requires you to stir for a very long time. You have to stir for probably 45 minutes to an hour nonstop. And to me, that was a metaphor that our culture, if you don't keep it moving, if you don't keep it changing, it will burn because that's what happens to a roux. The minute you stop stirring, it burns. So the metaphor for the whole book is trying to take something and keep it moving, keep it adapted, keep it shifting because it will turn into something beautiful and delicious.
And this tight knit community, is it something especially Cajun, Southern, or both?
So there's some historical pieces there that to maybe add into this. I had mentioned earlier that we were deported by the British. We were French settlers in what is now Nova Scotia in the 1600s, and we developed our own culture that actually was seen separate from French Canada and from France. We were known as the Acadians in Nova Scotia, and we were there for about 150 years, I think, is about the range we were there. And during that time, we changed hands between the French and the British over and over again. The British really wanted us to assimilate. They wanted us to change our religion. They wanted us to trade only with them. Cajuns are very stubborn people. We are nothing if not stubborn. And we eventually, the British had enough of us, and one particular, I believe it was a lieutenant, decided rid of us. So he rounded up everyone, put us on boats, and dispersed us across the world. Really, most of us ended up on the east coast of America, but many people ended up back in France. Some people ended up as far as the Falkland Islands, Haiti, French Guiana, and then eventually we ended up in South Louisiana. And the Spanish at the time were in control of South Louisiana. and gave us land plots because they were looking for people who knew how to work the land. And actually, we were known as good cattle people, and good ranchers. So they gave us land. And just so you know, the term Cajun is actually an Americanization of the word Acadian, because if you lived in Acadia, we called it in French Acadie. And if you're from Acadie, you're an Acadien. And then if you say it quickly like we do, it's Acadien. And then Cajun became Cajun.
Cajun.
So that is the whole ideology of that term. In Louisiana, we stayed in a very small area. In fact, I believe it's 14 parishes, and in Louisiana, instead of counties like the rest of America has, we have parishes. Again, we hold on to the old terminology and the old ways. In those 14 parishes, it's we even call it Acadiana. It's kind of like Acadia comes to Louisiana. And in those parishes, that is where you'll find the bulk of Acadian descendants. However, we have completely integrated with all the other cultures around us, or we have over the last 300 years. So most of the cuisine that you'll have in South Louisiana is not Acadian. It is, we call it Cajun because it is something new. Our favorite dish, my favorite dish, is a gumbo. And a gumbo has African American and Creole pieces. It has Acadian pieces, and it has even Native American pieces to it. So and even our French that we speak, when we travel to Acadia and to France, everybody kind of turns their head to the side. What are you saying? Because our dialect and our pronunciations are unique to Louisiana in a lot of ways. So when we say Cajun, it's a very strange word. It's shifting in definition, because originally it meant a person of Acadian descent, but in South Louisiana, it now kind of defines the culture, for better or for worse, because I don't know if everybody wants to be defined as Cajun, but that's kind of what ended up happening. But that's kind of the whole history that goes behind this small area. And I would say, directly related back to the book, you talked about a tight-knit community. Because Acadians were separated and we had this big cultural and generational trauma, the thinking behind this small, tight-knit community is, we'll never be separated again. Almost everybody that I know that is of Cajun culture never leaves Louisiana, even though I live one state over, and less than a day's drive away. I am very strange to have left Louisiana and not live right there. And what's even funnier, like if anything, we almost moved closer. My cousin moved into my uncle's backyard. We lived, my uncle cleared out all of his cattle that he had so that we could build a house in his backyard. So we were very, very tight knit. And if anything, it only seems like we tighten as time goes on.
That's something that Edison says in her inner monologue. Leaving Louisiana, I mean, it might be an option for her, because what happens to her, we won't give anything away, of course, but she doesn't feel okay with it. She can't even imagine it, leaving Louisiana, leaving her family. On the other hand, Will is looking forward to it. Or so he thinks. I mean, he's still young, he's 16, and he's looking forward to going to college, and he feels it a bit more, this oppression. I mean, he's coming to terms with who he is still.
But he might return after he moves away.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah.
Might miss it.
You might miss it. Yeah. To me, they were crossing in their experience of the culture, as he experienced it as almost solely oppressive. And his sister Addie experienced it as something that was beautiful, that was part of who she was, and that she never wanted to change about herself. But in his case, he began to lean into the oppressive parts and realize the beauty of them, the parts that were beautiful. And whenever she leaned into the oppressive parts, she realized it wasn't beautiful, that it was something that she would need to deal with. And I think some of that has to do with gender. I do think that, Cajun men get treated very differently than Cajun women. I've had this conversation with several Cajun women, like, men can get away with anything. We're, for all intents and purposes, we literally cannot do wrong. And if a Cajun woman does the same thing, Will never showed up with a gift to anyone. But at the minute Addie comes home to see her family and she doesn't have some sort of bread or food or flowers, what kind of daughter are you? You know, this sort of thing. So
Yeah, but you said Cajun men get away with everything, really everything, because that's Will's problem. Would he get away with it?
as far as are we alluding to Will struggling with his sexual orientation?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, Probably not. That part, that might be a line that he that would test the family. Now, I've seen in Cajun culture, I've actually seen it go both ways, and it really all depends on how you interpret the culture. Because the two things that are the primary importance in Cajun culture are family and religion. Religion and the Catholic religion side of Cajun culture is part of our identity. It gets folded right in. So it depends on the family. In Will's case, he was always afraid of it. He was always afraid of what would happen if his family began to know that his sexual orientation, that he was interested in men. He was afraid of that. Now, he never tested it. I won't steal too much from that, but he never had to test it, and you'll find out how that happens. But in the culture and reality, I think it ends up coming down to which part of the culture means more to you, family or religion. And then I think families end up choosing. Because if it's family, they find a way to accept and even sometimes affirm. And if it's religion, well, that doesn't always work out.
Maybe also the religion might be a tiny bit more lenient, do you think, than Protestantism, since we go to confession? I mean, I'm no longer a member of the church, but we both grew up Catholic, of course, here in Austria. So we always have a way to, get out of things.
I do think that that's possible. I do also think this, you asked earlier about our kind of small community. I do think that this is where the Cajun identity and we start to integrate with the South in America. That this very conservative view, this very traditional view on things, and this is where I think the Southern ideology starts to come in and starts to inform how to react in that way. So kind of the very, again, the traditional, the very view of the South informs religion in some ways. That Catholicism, I think, in Louisiana looks different than it even does on, say, the East Coast in America, than it does on, in other parts of the country, that it tends to lean more toward the very conservative, very traditional. And so I think there were, for Will and for many people inside the culture, there isn't the excusing it through religion. It becomes much more of a hard and fast and rule that can't be crossed.
As you mentioned, it depends on if they find the family or religion more important. Is it just the inside of the family, or also the view of others of the family that's important?
That's a really great question. I think, again, this is where the South, the American South, starts to inform it, that the perception becomes very important amongst others. So not only, and I think this even goes back to the previous question and goes back to what we were previously talking about, that the perception of others becomes even more of a policing factor than religion at times, that it becomes more of an edict to follow and how to look nice in front of other people. I know the mom in the book, both Addie to a certain extent, but definitely Beatrice, the mom in the book, she was very concerned about what everybody thought. And that's to the point where she didn't know what she thought sometimes, that she didn't know what she felt, and she didn't know what to think about herself or her family at times.
And another thing that ties into this question of how family will perceive them, Will and Addison, is the question of race. That's also a big part, or a big problem, or a thing that can be problematic within the community, within the family, probably.
So to me, this was, I kind of put little tidbits inside of Addison's story to kind of allude to this. This was a very interesting part that I felt needed to be told and needed to be talked about. The American South is unfortunately still has lots of racism in it, and that is still very true in South Louisiana. Now, where it becomes very interesting is that Cajuns were not always thought of as white. So Acadians even were not always thought of as white. And there's another history there. We fell under the label of Creole when we first arrived in Louisiana, but Creole was an umbrella term for anybody of European descent born in the States. So you could be German Creole, you could be Spanish Creole, you could be Caribbean Creole, you could be Acadian Creole. So the Creole was an umbrella term for all of us. As America accelerated toward its Civil War, the racial line became darker and darker and darker. And so Creole, because it incorporated so many different identities, people started to pull away from it. If you could pass for white, people would pull away from it. So define yourself any other way. I'm French, I'm Spanish, I'm not Creole, I'm Spanish. I'm not Creole, I'm Cajun, because Creole became synonymous with black, is eventually what ended up happening. But even after that, Cajuns were still not thought of as completely white. In fact, we have an ethnic slur they use on us. It's called, the ethnic slur is Coonass, which Coon is a derogatory term for a black person in America. And Coonass was supposed to be at least part of you is black. Maybe the part we can't see, but part of you is black.
Okay.
So there was this sense of hierarchy in American society, and we were above black, but somehow below white, despite being probably more European than some of the other people in the country. And so that particular part of the book where race comes up, I tried to point out the fact that here are people who neither of which are considered white, or at least completely white, who are struggling again with whiteness, despite the fact that neither of them fit there, but they're struggling with how that whiteness fits in their relationship, because that definitely is there. Because again, another part of, I think, being in America and having the racial tension that we have, there's this feeling, I think, at least among certain white people who don't get to be considered completely white, that they have to prove their whiteness in a way. And the way you prove your is by differentiating yourself from black. And so that was in Addie's relationship with a black man, is that she still felt herself in some way. She had to prove that she wasn't like him, even though he was everything she wanted and needed.
Is Creole a Spanish word?
It comes from the Spanish word criollo, which has then got adapted and I think anglicized to Creole. So yes.
And what does this mean?
So I'm actually not 100% sure. I'll be honest with you, but if I understood it correctly, it meant a person of mixed descent, is how I understood it. I actually could be wrong about that, but that is how I was speaking with a friend of mine, a Puerto Rican man, and he was saying we use Criollo, and then Creole is also used a lot in the Caribbean, and it means different things. And just so you know, in Haiti, the dialect of French they speak is called Creole. So it has different meanings depending on where you are. Even in Louisiana, so our biggest, or actually I'm not sure about population now, but what has historically been our biggest city was New Orleans, or is New Orleans. I'm actually sure it may be Baton Rouge now. I'm not sure, or Baton Rouge if I'm gonna speak proper French. But New Orleans is the Creole society. There became, again, layers, this hierarchy of race. And the Creole people in New Orleans they're seen as people. Their background is kind of the true Louisiana mixing pot. They're often have African American. They can have Native American. They can have Spanish, and really all of those ethnicities. So they tend to be in a lighter skinned person of color who typically New Orleans holds a higher social status. They are often highly educated, highly skilled in trades, and kind of almost hold, or historically, this is not so much true anymore, but held kind of this separate social or hierarchical structure from Black folk who say we're not Creole and didn't trace their family lineages to all the ethnicities that I named. Now, when you go to the part of the state where I'm from a part of the state that is less swamp and more prairie. So there's a lot more farms, there's a lot more ranchers, and Creole was often it was a French speaking cowboy. They're kind of that's who's there. They're these French speaking black or people of color. Often they consider may say they are black, they may say they are Creole, but that it's not a person who's in the upper echelon of society, say New Orleans. It's somebody who's on a farm with a cowboy hat on.
Oh, okay. And may I ask, we've been wondering when we spoke about the book, and we've mentioned already we have 4 perspectives. One perspective is missing. I mean, after reading the book, it makes sense why it is missing. On the other hand, it would have been interesting to read his perspective. I'm talking about Auguste, the hope I've pronounced it correctly.
Perfect.
The grandfather, who is a very vital part in the story, where you, or let me put it that way, did you think of putting it there, or never at all?
Never really, actually, never at all. I've had several people ask me this question: why didn't I include his perspective? And it was honestly for several reasons. The one of the main reasons was I feel like when it comes to our elders who feel like our mentors and our teachers, I never feel like they answer all the questions. I've never met a person who's ever said, I'm glad I learned everything I could have from my elder, that they left me with no questions, and I feel completely satisfied with everything that I understood. So in a way, I felt like that's reality, is that we don't get to hear everything our elders think, and we don't get to see how they've figured everything out. So that was one of the main drivers to me, that's what's real. Our elders we don't get all our answers. And that's really how his story ends. It ends in a giant question. So that was one reason that I did that. The reason too is I kind of wanted to immerse the reader in what I feel like is the confusing part of where we are currently in our times and in our Cajun culture, that we really do have to figure it out for ourselves. That if we keep looking backwards and we keep looking at the past, we're just going to get the answers of the past that don't necessarily fit the present anymore. There are lessons there are values, there are traditions that we should keep, but we need to be deliberate and thoughtful about what those traditions are. So I wanted to immerse the reader in this feeling of we need to figure it out, and kind of each of the characters struggles of how do I make sense of this family? How do I make sense of where I fit in my culture, and what does my culture mean to me? To me, that was the reason that I needed to keep him in the background, so that the characters could figure it out for themselves.
And the father of the family, John, he's still, I mean, he's in his 40s, and he's still figuring out who he is. I mean, for Will, we do understand. I mean, he's 16 and hormones and whatnot, you know. But John is also figuring it out. And when we learn about his past and what he gives as an advice to his son, learn French, or he did learn French so he could know what people were saying about him. And yet he's somewhere in between. I mean, he's part of the whole culture, and yet he's outside a little bit of the culture, and also his past, his family, what people say about his father, and the way he experienced his father. There's also something that is very troubling to him, to come to terms with everything that happened.
That was all very well said. I'm glad you got all that, because that's everything I was aiming to do with John. To me, John is he's an unfortunate fact of the current state of Cajun men. Going back to something that I mentioned earlier, I think John is a direct result of getting away with too much. That he only thinks about himself. He can't really think about his place within his culture and within his family, because and to me also John is a result of Americanization and kind of the the more capitalistic values that America can have sometimes,
Yeah.
making their way into this older culture that's really about, taking care of family. Because that was August's last thing he said to him was, if you want to, you've been trying to fight your whole life, why don't you go take care of your family? So John stuck, to your point, I think, between trying to be part of American culture and still being Cajun and not being able to completely get rid of all those things. I also thought something that I've really appreciated, a lot of artists, like musical artists in Louisiana, and a lot of commentators in Louisiana, we've commodified a lot of our culture, whether it be through our food, through our personalities, through kind of the mystique of South Louisiana, whatever it may be, us being those swamp people. We've commodified our culture. And that's, to me, what John did, is he only speaks with an accent whenever it's going to fit him, and it's going to do well for him. He only talks about his Cajun culture whenever it will interest someone else. But he doesn't actually live it out. He doesn't try to figure it out for himself. And again, without stealing too much, that's why the book ends with him the way it does. And it's, if you go back and look, his spot in the book ends differently than the other three. They have an ending that intersects, whereas his doesn't look like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, as you mentioned, his Americanization. Is there the fear in Cajun culture that it will be diluted more and more until it disappears?
Yes. There's definitely a fear of that. And it's been a fear for many years. So back in, I believe, the 40s and 50s, there was this big push in America to make America more uniform. So in schools, if you spoke anything other than English, you could be physically punished. Grandmother would tell me that if she spoke French at school, she would get hit, she would get beat. And so she used to tell me, she said she learned English. She said, I learned English fast me, because I didn't want to get beat. I didn't want to get hit at school. And that was true actually for other cultures here as well. I know in Texas, I hear the same stories. People that I work with and people that I know, friends, tell me, yeah, that was my grandparents. When they spoke Spanish at school, they would get physically hit or abused. So that in just 2 generations. So my grandparents' French was their first language. My parents, they're bilingual, and they both speak. My father's conversational and my mother is fluent, but they didn't teach me. I heard French all the way around me growing up, but French was a language of ignorance in South Louisiana for a while. So I learned French. I have whenever I speak French, I always confuse people because it's half Parisian, half Cajun, because I learned in school. I learned Parisian French at school. So there are definite differences in pronunciation. Cajuns never use the back of their throat whenever they say anything. We actually move things to the front of our mouth, almost like in Spanish, like too much in French, or a lot in French is trop. But in Cajun French, you'd say trop. You put an H in there. Trouble is tracas. In Cajun French, is tracas. So there are things like that. And we do fun things like we soften our vowels a lot. So misery is misère. But in Cajun French, it's misère. C'est trop misère. It's too much misery.
It sounds a little bit,
bit of Spanish.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know how we came to that. I mean, again, we lived in Louisiana when the Spanish were ruling, so there's a chance that that's where our languages kind of intersected. But as far as we were talking about I'm sorry, I lost you. The culture and how it shifted. It started to come back whenever I was in school. French immersion programs started popping up all over Louisiana. And now there's a lot of people. There's French schools, French immersion schools. There's one that just opened actually this year in South Louisiana. They're still opening up. You can tune in early if you're ever interested. The KRVS is the radio station in Lafayette, Louisiana, and podcast called Bonjour Louisiane, and it's all in Cajun French, and it's all Cajun French music. So if you ever want to tune in, they're live every morning, and you can go look through all of the podcasts from before. It's excellent. It's good early morning music. Yeah, there's a lot of Cajun French artists. We still have a lot of Cajun French music. We love accordions in our music. We're big on accordions. There's people like Cedric Watson and Jordan Thibodeau. Those are two people that I listen to a lot, and they're all about talking about our culture and about not losing it. So, still singing in French, not converting over to English, and doing interviews in French. And so they're both people that I love listening to and watching, trying to figure out how to fit our culture again in this modern world.
I mean, the accordion is an instrument which is also used in Austria a lot, in the folk music especially. So it's known to us. I mean, we did listen to some Cajun music before we came on the podcast, and it's nice.
Yeah,
it's a catchy tune.
Now there's Cajun, and then now there's also Zydeco, which Zydeco has its roots more in the African American culture and Black Creole culture. They kind of grew up together. They came from the same roots, but they diverged a little bit. Zydeco will have much like a deeper beat to it, have much more of a quick beat to it. Cajun tunes tend to be more sad and bluesy, waltzes, a lot of waltzes. We do a lot of waltzes. So they're different, and they're both wonderful.
Okay. And this family name, because I read up a little bit on Louisiana and Lafayette, I think it was a conscious decision for the family name.
It was. You might have come across General Mouton. Did you come across his name? Yeah. And then there's a lot of controversy even about his statue right now, General Mouton, in Lafayette. There's streets named after him, and he was a slave owner. And I think I did think about the history of that name. I also thought about what Mouton means. Mouton is sheep, and that's what this family is. That they're sheep. They're following the culture, and not really thinking about how to lead themselves out of it. They're following the edicts of everybody and everything around them, what America says they should be, whether their past says they should be, or even their gender says they should be. They're just sheep following, and they have to figure it out for themselves. They have to learn how to figure it out themselves. So that was a big part of me naming Mouton. Part was the history, but a big part was what it means. They're just sheep.
Yeah, it's also something that Will says to his mother, isn't it? I mean, they're stuck in the past, like you said, and they look through a hole, and without realizing actually that maybe they are the ones who are locked in, not the others.
There is this feeling inside Louisiana. Cajuns, I think we think we're the center of the world, and so we look at the rest of the world like, wow, look at how crazy they are, never realizing like maybe we're the ones who are kind of crazy ourselves, that we have our own strange way of doing things, and we have our own strange way of looking at things, just as strange as anybody else's, really. So that was a big piece of why Will said that, we're just as strange as everybody else. We judge everybody, but we're in this boat. We need to figure ourselves out.
How, like you said before, how to continue, how to bring the past and the present together and move on to the future. And may I ask about your plans, writing as a writer? What's next from you?
Well, actually, I have another book coming out in February 2025. It is a short story collection, again, based in Louisiana. Completely different, though. It is going to be set 50 years in the future, and it's about what Louisiana would be like if climate change really took over. So half of the state is underwater, and it's 9 different stories focused on 9 different pieces. So one's about music, one's about food, one's about language, faith, government, wildlife, weather, and farming. So each story focuses on different aspects of the culture. And it's just about what changes and what doesn't. Again, we're stubborn people. There's some things I don't know if we'll ever be able to change, even if we tried. And then there's other things that we have no choice. If the world changes the way we think it might, We're right there in the middle of everything. In fact, a recent report said that the water in the Gulf of Mexico is rising much faster and it's getting much hotter than they had originally thought it would. So we're right in the crosshairs.
Doesn't sound so good
No.
for Louisiana, actually. And Toby, what would be your advice for any other author, be he or she Cajun or not?
Any other aspiring author, the best advice I received or the best advice I read while I was writing Dark Rue was write scared. That if you are afraid while you're writing, it means you're speaking to a deeper truth. You're speaking to something that needs to be said, and you may be the only person to say it. So if you feel nice and comfy while you're writing your truth, you're probably not writing the deepest truth possible. You have to be scared to get to it. I was petrified the entire time that I wrote this novel. Every time I open it and read from it, I still feel a deep, deep fear of, I feel like my ancestors are rolling in their graves, like, what'd you do? You told us secrets, that's the feeling that I have. But write scared is my advice for any author. And as far as for anybody who's writing from inside our culture, I actually was just having this conversation with a good friend of mine who is also Cajun, who had just finished reading my novel, and we were talking over the different parts of it that we both recognize in ourselves and in our culture. And the thing that came out of that conversation is Cajun isn't one thing. I think in a lot of ways that because the community is so small and because we're so insulated, that sometimes we pigeonhole ourselves. That we think that Cajun can only be a certain type of person who does a certain type of thing and thinks a certain type of way. So for anybody who may be listening who's in a Cajun family, part of a Cajun culture, it isn't just one thing. It's so many things.
And now on to the recipes.
Yeah, because in the title, it is a food title. And food is a big part of a culture.
Yes.
Any culture.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Fully agree.
So, any tips?
Yeah, what can you share with us and our listeners?
So how about we talk about my favorite dish?
Yes, please.
How about we talk about gumbo? Because it is truly a Louisiana cuisine. So just a little bit history. Gumbo is actually not a French word or a Native American word. It is an African word that is derived from, I believe it's pronounced oingambo, which means okra. So
okay.
There can be okra in gumbo. There's not always okra in gumbo. There can be roux in gumbo. There's not always roux in gumbo. A lot of people think that gumbo means seafood. That's not always true. Again, I came from the prairie side of Louisiana, so we did more sausage, chicken, duck, things like that. So what I'm going to share with you is how to make a gumbo as you would make in Southwest Louisiana from the prairies. So this is chicken and sausage gumbo. And as so many Cajun dishes, how it starts is with a roux. Now, roux is just a mixture of flour and some sort of fat. You can use really any sort of fat. You can use butter. You can use oil. I've even used duck fat before. I know you can use bacon fat or even beef fat. It's really whatever your preference is. But basically, it's an equal mixture of the two. Usually I start with a little bit less oil and see where I get as far as consistency. But you just heat up your oil until you can take a pinch of flour and it will start to fry in the oil, that you'll see it start to bubble. And then you mix, again, equal parts or maybe a little bit less to start of flour into your oil. And you're now going to stir. Just so you know, the best pot I've ever found to make a roux is always an iron pot. Tend to distribute heat evenly and stay hot for keep the heat really well for the gumbo. But you're going to stir that roux well past what you think you should. It's a little bit, the first time anybody ever makes a roux, they always think they're going to burn it, which is a very real possibility. The minute you stop stirring, if you stop for even say 5 or 10 seconds, the bottom will burn and you have to start over because the whole thing will just taste like burn, and it's not pleasant at all. But you're going to stir your roux. I usually I keep it on about a medium heat, so a medium amount of heat, but you can do it. Make sure that if it's browning quickly, you don't want it to brown too quick because it'll burn. If it's taking too long to brown, you may want to turn the heat up. But you're going to watch it turn from the very light tan color. It's going to become caramel, and when you're approaching milk chocolate or even dark chocolate, that is what you're aiming for. So it will get a very, very, very dark color. At that point, you can turn off your heat, remove it from the heat, but keep stirring because if you're using a cast iron pot, it will burn still. You can slow it down, though this is what a lot of us do in Louisiana. You can stop the heat pretty quickly by adding what we affectionately call, and we use a Catholic term for this, we add the Trinity. Now, the Trinity in Louisiana is diced bell pepper, onions, and celery. That's the Trinity. And then if you just grab a couple of handfuls of that and put it into your roux, it should slow it down. It'll sizzle and maybe even pop a little, so be careful. But that'll get the temperature down, which is what you need. And at that point, you can, once the roux is no longer at risk of burning, if you've been doing this in a large black pot, you can start to add either water or, to be honest, I think chicken stock or any sort of protein stock makes it taste really good. Chicken stock, if you're making a chicken and sausage gumbo, that's the best thing to do. So at this point, you have your base for your gumbo. Then we begin to add meats. We typically use smoked sausage, and typically smoked pork sausage is what we use. And you can use any kind of chicken. My family has gotten spoiled, and they like to have they like chicken thighs only, deboned. They don't want bones in their gumbo, but they're in no way are you held to that. But the best way to really get the flavor out of your gumbo is to sear your chicken and sausage before it goes into the gumbo. So with a little bit more oil, or even what I find is even better is start cooking your sausage until it releases some of its oil, and then cook your chicken in that.
Do you leave the meat in the sausage whole, or do you cut it in smaller pieces?
Sorry, yes, great question. You can do either. Again, growing up, whenever we had chicken and sausage gumbo, there would be whole pieces of chicken, whole wings, whole drumsticks. The chicken breasts and the chicken thighs would typically be cut up. But my family, again, is spoiled, so I cut up all of this boneless chicken thighs and sometimes chicken breast as well. And just so you know, for gumbos, if you're going to use chicken, if you use an old hen, they hold up better in a gumbo and tend to have a lot more flavors. So instead of a young chicken, an old hen will be a lot more flavorful. While you're cooking your chicken and your sausage, you can go ahead and season them with as much Cajun seasoning as you like. Now, I don't know if it would reach all the way to Europe and all the way to Austria, but it's really easy nowadays to get pre-mixed Cajun seasoning just already in a can. I'm wondering if you'd be able to find it there. The most popular comes in a green can with a little chef on it called Tony. We pronounce it chasseries, but that's not actually how you're supposed to say it. But Tony Chachere's. That is kind of a standard. There is one that comes out of Louisiana that has a very strange name. It's called Slap Ya Mama, and that one is very popular and very, very good. But if you don't have Cajun seasoning, it's really things that you already have likely in your pantry. It's salt, black pepper, white pepper, garlic powder, onion powder, paprika, and cayenne pepper. Cayenne pepper is the part that everybody always thinks about when they think of Cajun cooking. They think about the spicy things. It's cayenne pepper. And I would, in your case, if you want to make your own, I would experiment. See how much pepper you like, see how much salt you like. Those pre manufactured cans that I was mentioning, they have a really great balance and blend. But if you're doing it on your own, I'd say spend a little time before you make your gumbo, kind of putting together your seasoning in a way that you like it. And then season very, very liberally your meat as you're cooking. As you sear them, you can just start putting them into your gumbo pot, and you may want to do it in batches depending on how much meat you're putting in, just so that you don't cool your pan off too much. And just keep loading that into your gumbo. And what you're going to do is keep it on a simmer. Once your meat's in, once you have your roux has been well integrated into the stock, your Trinity has been seared really well. And by the way, that Trinity, you can put as much of that as you want. I talked about it at the beginning of slowing down the roux, but really I'll usually saute up some more, maybe before I put my chicken and my sausage in, and there's you cannot get enough flavor out of those things. And usually, by the way, we throw in lots of garlic. That's also makes this dish. Lots and lots of garlic. A little worried about the Trinity. If you decide to saute some up, which is again something that I really like to do, saute it until you think it's too much, and it's starting to dry and maybe start to feel like it's sticking to the pan a little bit too much. Go ahead and deglaze it. Go ahead and put a cup of water in there or a cup of stock in there and let it deglaze and let it cook down again until it almost looks like it's going to stick to the pan to where it looks like mush. That will give you some of the best flavor that you could find in your gumbo. So at this point, once you've added all these ingredients to your gumbo, at this point, it's just a matter of letting it simmer. Season it as you see fit. If you want some more spice, add more spice, more salt. Just keep it into a place. And just so you know, I don't know if y'all have this trick, but a trick always in my house, if you ever over salt something that's in a soup, put a potato in it, and it will suck up that salt. So just to keep in mind, keep that in your back pocket. Once you have simmered it for several hours until it is reaching the flavor and consistency that you want, and generally roux kind of splits the difference, or not roux, sorry, gumbo splits the difference between stew and soup. So think of a thickness in between stew and soup. That's where you want to aim for in a gumbo. And you will serve it over rice. Okay. And it's usually 2/3 gumbo to 1/3 rice. So, 2 cups of gumbo over 1 cup of rice. And now you can garnish. The garnish is kind of part of the experience. It's part of the fun. Traditional Cajun garnishes or traditional gumbo garnishes in Southwest Cajun country are chopped green onions or spring onions, fresh parsley, and then we also have something, ground sassafras leaves. This is actually the contribution of the Native American. Ground sassafras leaves, we call it filet. And you can put filet on top, and it will add a slightly tangy flavor to your gumbo, which is very good. And then if you're like me, you're going to add even more hot sauce. We have Tabasco sauce or Louisiana hot sauce or Dixie hot sauce. And you're going to add, depending on your flavor profile, how much heat you like. I like a lot of heat. As a lot of us Cajuns do, and I will add hot sauce on top of that. So the garnish is a very important part of the dish. And then after that, I recommend eating it on a cooler night, maybe than tonight that you'll have over there, because it will keep you warm all night long.
A winter dish then for here, for our parts of the world.
We even say, in Louisiana, we have the way the weather works in the South is we never really have winter. We just have a series of cool fronts. So it'll get cool for about 2 or 3 days, and then it'll go back to mild, 73 degrees. There's been several holidays in the winter where I'm wearing shorts and in a short sleeve shirt because it's so warm down here. So we always laugh that the first cool front that comes in town, you can hear every gumbo pot in the city come out of the pantry. Everybody's immediately cooking gumbo.
That's a good advice for us here, because we do have cold nights and cold evenings here. So it's a good idea to try it out then when it's getting cold or colder. It can
sounds tasty.
Yes, absolutely tasty, and it can happen very fast here that it gets cold. Oh, I'm already hungry. Ooh. It sounds absolutely great. Toby, thanks for the recipe. But also another question, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
For any of you who ever make it down to Louisiana, there's lots of things in the book that we have to work on, I'll admit it, within our families, within ourselves. But there's nothing we love more than company. So should you ever find yourself on this side of the ocean, come on down. We'd love to cook you something. We'd love to host you. We'd love to invite you out for a dance and keep you up way too late, chop your ear off, hear all about what's going on in your life and tell you all about ours. So we would love the company. Come visit us.
Sounds absolutely lovely.
Yeah.
Something one should absolutely do. Teacup.
Yep.
So, Toby, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Mine as well.
Oh, Teacup. Noisy as hell, is she? It was wonderful, and the listeners should take your book and read it. It's a wonderful book. It's a fascinating book about Cajun history, about Cajun tradition, about Cajun life. And yeah, we're absolutely looking forward to more from you.
Thank you so much.
You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.